Hello and welcome everyone. The following is a Patreon request by Mitchell Martinez, and you too can contribute to my Patreon, including the ability to see my reviews early among other perks, and I could even do a review of your choosing. In fact, I actually have several more Patreon requests coming up in the near future. But for now though, let's cast our minds back beyond the superhero genre as we know it today. Recently released at the time of this video is the big screen adaptation of Stanley and Steve Ditko's creation Doctor Strange, about a surgeon whose quest to repair his damaged hands leads him towards his destiny as the Sorcerer Supreme, defending Earth from magical threats. It's been brought to the screen by writer-director Scott Derrickson and writer C. Robert Cargill, the team behind the Sinister movies, and in case you somehow haven't seen it or my review yet, it's a very enjoyable bit of escapism. It's the latest installment of the hugely successful Marvel Cinematic Universe, released in a year where such movies are not only relatively commonplace, but some of the biggest blockbusters around, and audiences flock to see them in their droves. It's a plentiful time for comic book fans, but that wasn't the case 25 years ago, where fans had to be grateful for all the little scraps they got in terms of screen adaptations, especially films. By the 70s, superheroes were largely consigned to television, especially with the success of The Incredible Hulk and Wonder Woman, which heavily retooled their characters into the limited constraints of their low-budget series, but their serial nature proved a good fit for comic book sources. Although Superman got a lavish, big-budget version in 1978, its huge budget for the time likely scared off many imitators despite its success, achieving 4 films and a Supergirl spin-off at diminishing returns across the 80s. The best you could hope for was that your favourite hero got himself a failed feature-length pilot like Captain America, or an appearance in a thinly veiled backdoor pilot like Thor and Daredevil in the Incredible Hulk TV movie follow-ups. The genre was definitely undervalued at the time, where you had the likes of Dolph Lundgren's The Punisher, minus his signature skull on the costume so he was just another generic action hero, or Schlock Factory Cannon trying and failing to make their version of Spider-Man. But things changed dramatically with Tim Burton's Batman, a film that not only cast aside Adam West's campy version of the character, but was a huge hit with audiences and critics and commercially. In 1989, that movie was everywhere, from toys to tie-ins to the Prince soundtrack, all under the Batman logo that was practically a brand. The gigantic success of Batman set the course for a number of superhero adaptations to come, and in the early 90s, many films tried to recapture its success. Batman's gothic Art Deco stylings will be echoed many times, with some of them trying to recapture the tone of the old movie serials, usually in a period setting such as The Rocketeer or The Shadow. But the rights to the Marvel characters were scattered among a number of small production companies, so this period saw canon successors 21st Century Film Corporation make their infamous version of Captain America, or Constantin Films working with Roger Corman on the famously unreleased Fantastic Four to retain the rights. So you ended up with this weird situation of iconic characters getting disappointingly cheap treatment. Which brings us nicely to Dr. Mordrid, a very unusual curiosity in the long-running development of bringing Marvel's Doctor Strange to the big screen, a process that began 30 years ago and finally culminated in the Benedict Cumberbatch film. There have been some previous screen incarnations of Doctor Strange. He actually got one of those aforementioned failed TV pilots in 1978, written and directed by Philip DeGuere Jr., with Stanley serving as consultant and starring Peter Hooton as the title character, looking remarkably like Bradley Cooper in American Hustle. I've previously reviewed it on Radio Dead Air, and it's badly dated and very dull, taking 90 minutes to get to very little, with Strange not even getting into costume until the final 10 minutes, and the limited special effects looking like Doctor Who on psychedelics. There was later a 2007 animated feature which is much truer to the character but is let down by an uninvolving, stilted script and the shortcuts in its animation. But getting the character to the screen has proved challenging. By the time of Dr. Mordrid, the likes of Back to the Future's Bob Gale, Wes Craven and Repo Man's Alex Cox all had tries that failed to come to fruition for various reasons. The challenge with adapting the character is that not only is his mythology quite complex, but his powers also require huge amounts of special effects, and this was at a time when CGI was in its relative infancy. Now this is where things get complicated. Apparently the rights briefly fell into the hands of Albert and Charles Band of Full Moon Features, who were developing their own adaptation. The reason I say it gets complicated is that I'm not sure when this occurred. You see, in the late 80s, Charles Band was developing a superhero film called Dr. Mortalis at his Empire Pictures, and even got artist Jack Kirby to pitch the story and draw concept art, and it was clear that this was a loosely disguised version of Doctor Strange. I've read the synopsis and it has almost no relation to the plot of Dr. Mordrid, centering on two sorcerers fighting in a small town Superman 2 style, but the artwork Kirby drew bears a striking resemblance to Mordrid's cover art. This isn't the only Band-Kirby collaboration, as another Kirby pitch called Mindmaster got supposedly reworked in what would eventually become MANDROID. When Empire went bankrupt, Charles opened Full Moon Features, which specialised in direct-to-video sci-fi and fantasy films, and in 1992, Mortalis became Mordrid. Now, either Band had the Strange rights in the 80s, or he had them in the early days of Full Moon and lost them before production began, and reworked the script around the old Mortalis ideas. There's also the possibility that Band never had the rights at all, but wanted to do something with the character and thus created a similar one, like how Sam Raimi invented Darkman because he wasn't allowed to use the Shadow. Either way, the film bears a credit that says it's based on an original idea by Charles Band, which is a rather loose interpretation of the word original. If you were a fan of Doctor Strange, at least you had an unofficial option that was a better alternative to something that was so 70s it wore flares. But what exactly is it about? Anton Mordrid, played by Jeffrey Combs, is a reclusive sorcerer from another dimension who has been sent to protect the Earth from dark forces and has spent the last 100 years preparing for such an attack. He begins to attract the attention of Samantha Hunt, played by Yvette Naper, a tenant in the apartment complex that Mordrid owns and a police researcher on occult matters. When Mordrid learns of a series of thefts of platinum and diamonds, he travels to the fourth dimension, where his evil brother Cabal, played by Brian Thompson, is imprisoned, only to learn that he's escaped to Earth and is responsible for the incidents. Cabal is attempting to bring the elements together to summon a spell that will release his Hellspawn imprisoned on the fourth dimension and bring them to Earth, which would plunge the world into apocalypse, and only Mordrid, with the help of Samantha, has the power to stop him. So far, so Doctor Strange. In fact, the story wouldn't look out of place in the comic books, but how similar are Mordrid and Strange exactly? In terms of appearance, powers and abilities, Strange and Mordrid are quite similar. Both of them wear cloaks, for instance. Mordrid's is blue, although unlike Strange's red cloak of levitation that allows him to fly, it doesn't appear to grant him any abilities with it. Like Strange, who wears the Eye of Agamotto, Mordrid too also carries an amulet, and its primary purpose is to distract his enemies, releasing a flash that temporarily freezes in time those who see it, allowing enough time for Mordrid and or Samantha to escape. Unlike Strange, who can magically conjure weaponry, it appears that this is relatively limited. In one scene, Mordrid is seen phasing knife-like crystals into his body, which he then flies out like projectiles, but it seems like it's fairly scarce in quantity. Instead, Mordrid and Cabal primarily conjure spells and beams from their hands, which they can fire at each other or take control of objects or other people. Strange and Mordrid can also travel to other dimensions and move into the astral plane, which proves pivotal to the climax of the film, as it allows Mordrid to jump to the museum in time to stop Cabal faster than it would for his physical form to get there. As you can tell, the two are very similar on that level, but what really separates the two characters is their backstories. Classically, Doctor Strange is a brilliant neurosurgeon whose hands are severely damaged in a car accident, who discovers magic in his destiny in a last-ditch attempt to repair them. Although it should be noted that that 1970s TV movie didn't use that backstory, but kept him as a regular doctor, likely to focus on a medical element should it have made it to series. Mordrid, on the other hand, has a doctorate to justify his title, although exactly what it is unspecified, but presumably paranormal psychology, judging from one scene where Samantha goes to one of his lectures that's purely there to make clear why he's a doctor, with a little winking self-reference.
We all know that when things get a little crazy, someone always remarks, "It must be a full moon tonight."
Mordrid has come from another dimension to protect Earth, and he appears to have a very long lifespan, and he has had past lovers that he briefly glimpses in his pocket watch. It's later revealed that he and Cabal are brothers and train together, with one being good, the other evil, a development that gives Cabal shades of classic Strange villain Baron Mordo if it's turned into a conventional sibling rivalry. Mordrid's lair is inside the apartment complex that he owns, keeping his presence and identity as a landlord very secretive. Again, again a twist on the Sanctum Sanctorum that Strange calls his home. Mordrid's apartment is intentionally oversized and TARDIS-like, filled with trinkets, artifacts and books that the camera lovingly pans over in the opening title sequence, alongside his pet raven, Edgar Allan, and in general it's a fantastic set that gives the production a grander feel than it actually has, which is probably why so much of the film takes place there. In short, their skills are very similar to each other, but their different personalities alters Mordrid enough to be a character in his own right, although a lot of that comes down to the work of Jeffrey Combs in the title role. Combs has a large number of genre credits, being particularly familiar to horror fans for his work in films like the Re-Animator series, The Frighteners and From Beyond, to his recurring work across various Star Trek TV series. He's also a regular of Full Moon and Empire Pictures from the period, including Castle Freak, Trancers 2 and The Pit and the Pendulum. Combs normally brings a very larger-than-life campy quality to many of his roles, but Mordrid sees him in a much straighter role than usual, playing the hero, and he's in far more reserved form here. He gives the part a certain amount of mystique and credibility that grounds the character in an exaggerated reality where magic and sorcery exist, and there's a touch of melancholy about his portrayal that's appropriate for someone who has lived for so long with such responsibility. Combs' trademark oddball quirks are much more subtle here, which gives you the sense that something slightly unusual about Mordrid, that he's a man slightly out of time. He has the same touch of B-movie matinee idol that Bruce Campbell can bring, that gives an old-fashioned quality to our hero in a modern setting. Or it could just be that he uses French presses as coffee cups, the absolute weirdo. Regardless, he also shares solid chemistry with Yvette Napier as Samantha, and she gives a fairly strong performance too, especially in the film's earlier stages, where it focuses on her curiosity around a mysterious neighbour, serving as the audience's surrogate, although her only other prominent credit is her starring role in the RoboCop TV series. The films made at Empire Pictures and Full Moon were very much family affairs in front and behind the camera, and Dr. Mordrid is no exception, with 3 generations of bands involved one way or another. The film's directed by father and son Albert and Charles Band. The eldest, Albert, would take over directing duties depending on how busy Charles was with operating Full Moon, especially given that Mordrid was one of 6 pictures they released in 1992. Albert Band had been directing movies since the late 50s, largely horror films, but his main focus was as a producer, and he moved away from the director's chair in the late 70s to help Charles finance Empire Pictures during the 80s. He later returned to helm a few films for Full Moon and Empire, like GHOULIES 2, and the father and son would later work together again on Prehysteria. The music is composed by Charles's brother Richard, who works on the Full Moon movies to this day, and also works on Empire releases like the Re-Animator films and From Beyond, and his dramatic and fantastical score helps give the film a sense of scope and presence that to a certain extent hides its low-budget origins. Charles's son Alex has an uncredited cameo as a kid in the museum who briefly speaks to Cabal. He would later become a musician fronting the band The Calling. But even aside from direct family relations, there's plenty of Full Moon regulars elsewhere. C. Courtney Joyner wrote the script, and he has many of the studio's credits to his name, such as several entries in the PUPPETMASTER series and Trancers 3, which he also directed. The most interesting credit, though, is David Allen, who is the animator that worked on the film's stop-motion effects that are especially prominent in the climactic dinosaur battle that would make Ray Harryhausen proud. Allen has worked on the likes of Gumby, Willow, Young Sherlock Holmes and Ghostbusters 2, but worked extensively with Charles Band. Many of the creature effects you see in other Full Moon films like Subspecies, the PUPPETMASTER franchise and the Trancers series were created by him, and Full Moon's signature little critters are briefly seen as the demons that Cabal wants to unleash. Allen's effects work really well in this film, although most of it is composites, split screens and matte, like the other dimensional castle that's used to expand the backdrop past the physical set, but it gives the film production value and scale despite its low budget. In general, Dr. Mordrid is quite slickly produced and made for what it is, but my problems with the film is that only goes so far to hiding its limitations. Charles Band considered his Full Moon features to be, quote, like a networking video, saying that they release pilots for features that, if they work well, they go to series. That makes sense in a lot of ways when it comes to Dr. Mordrid, because even though it's a 74-minute feature, it has many of the problems you see in TV pilots and movies, namely the lack of action. This is a classic case of an ambitious idea in a very limited execution, where the vast majority of the film is made up of dialogue and exposition that set up and explain things that the filmmakers just aren't able to visualise, and that becomes rather dry and uneventful after a certain point. The film does try to turn this weakness into a strength by focusing on Samantha for its first half, but even with its brief running time, the film feels restricted and overstretched, especially since the story is very basic. Our hero has to stop the bad guy from destroying the world, and that brief sentence pretty much sums it up. There's some time given to world and character building, but it too often feels like it's stalling for time, particularly in the second half, where Mordrid is framed for murder by Cabal and spends much of it locked in a police station. Speaking of Cabal, he's a very weak villain. Normally Brian Thompson could be relied upon to play a memorable heavy, but he's barely given any screen time here and only has 2 major encounters with Mordrid, so he just comes across as a stock antagonist. The revelation that the two are brothers is deployed far too late in the narrative, nor does it add anything to the proceedings other than a flimsy attempt to add substance to a paper-thin villain. But you can't get away from the fact that it feels like a prologue that's only maybe an act and a half before it comes to an abrupt conclusion. No doubt this was intended to be a series, but obviously it didn't do well enough to justify a continuation given this was a relatively higher budget project for the studio, which is something of a shame given the actors and the behind the scenes footage seemed welcome to a sequel, and I would have been a bit more forgiving of the film if there was a follow-up that delivered more on what it intended to be. It doesn't really work as a film on its own terms, but even with that said, there are other issues with Mordrid by itself that likely accounted for why it wasn't successful. Tonally, the film sits in quite uncertain territory. This is at a time when Full Moon, with its deal with Paramount, was starting to diversify, including its family sub-label Moonbeam, and Mordrid seems to be attempting some wider mainstream appeal. It's less horror or sci-fi heavy than many of the studio's other films, and the content in general is largely clean. However, it's still an R-rated movie, and it feels like that decision was made during production, because the 4 or 5 uses of fuck, mostly by Cabal's follower Adrian, are rather jarring, but that's nothing compared to the sudden moments of full frontal nudity from fellow follower Irene, played by Julie Michaels, in what initially appears to be a prelude to a sex scene before he ultimately sacrifices her to help cast his spell. But it feels completely gratuitous, almost like the bands wanted to throw it in to satisfy the label's fans and justify the adult rating, and it didn't help that she's killed off before doing anything else. Most of the film's faults come from the script, which has a lot of strands that don't go anywhere or make a lot of sense. In the second half of the film, Cabal gives Adrian invincibility so he can go after Mordrid, but only a few scenes later he removes that power for no reason whatsoever, without even knowing if he accomplished his aim, and it doesn't even factor until after Cabal's death, where you could have easily said that the spell died with its sorcerer. Worse, Adrian is a bumbling anarchist bad guy who poses next to no threat anyway, but he seems to be in the movie more than Cabal is. Towards the end of the film, when Mordrid escapes the police station, he's stopped by a cop and for some inexplicable reason magically creates a gun so he can pretend he's holding Samantha hostage, which makes him look like a criminal for no reason at all. Especially since his amulet can freeze people and he easily disarms the cop anyway, and it only serves to destroy his Earth life irreparably. And for all the time spent on her character, all Samantha really gets to do in the climax is look after Mordrid's sleeping body in a park, and even Adrian arrives too late to actually do anything there. Are there things I like? Certainly. I've mentioned the sets and the performances, but it's that general old-fashioned feel the film has, aided by its practical effects and in-camera trickery that harken back to cinema's earliest days. And it's also aided immensely by having been shot on film rather than cheap digital video that Full Moon's more recent films have, and it gives the film a real cinematic quality those lack. Would I recommend this movie to comic book fans or people who are looking for more after seeing Doctor Strange? Maybe not wholeheartedly. I think it very much depends on the audience. If you're a younger fan who has grown up with the comic book films of this generation, this isn't going to be for you, and you will likely find it quite tedious and uninvolving by comparison. On the other hand, if you are someone who is familiar with the comic book adaptations made around this time and have a soft spot for them, by all means give Dr. Mordrid a look, since it's definitely an interesting film to watch considering its production, and you might even think it has a certain charm that allows you to overlook its imperfections, although I keep my expectations relatively low. You can easily buy the film on Blu-ray Blu-ray, where it's been given a HD remaster that for the most part looks great and far superior to how people would have seen it on VHS back in the day. My bugbear though is that it appears that Band decided to crop the movie into widescreen, and while this doesn't look too bad for the majority, there are definitely shots that look misframed or very tight in ways that don't look natural, especially in comparison to the 4:3 clips and the making of featurette in the bonus features, and I would have preferred that it was released in that aspect ratio because it was obviously framed with its video origins in mind. Regardless, it's a solid disc with a commentary, interviews, a vintage featurette, and plenty of B-roll footage should you wish to delve further. Dr. Mordrid is a curiosity, a strange episode in the superhero genre that still casts a spell over intrigued audiences, even if I'm not one of them. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.